pleased to welcome Dr. Assal Rad back to Wider View. She's a research fellow of the National Iranian American Council and received her PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of California in Irvine in 2018. And welcome back, Assal.
Thank you for having me again.
So Iran is one of the hotspots of this COVID-19 pandemic. There are now nearly 40,000 people infected, from what I've read, and nearly 3,000 deaths. What are you hearing from friends and family with contact in Iran, and how are people coping there?
This has been going on now since February 19th was when the first cases hit in Iran. And so really people were scared within that first week. So now it's been over a month that there's been some fear of it spreading, and it started spreading fairly fast in Iran, and partially because the government didn't really take the steps necessary to curb it, right? And we've seen these missteps from a number of states, our own included, of course, but there's this debate about what is the situation there. Is it the sanctions or is it mismanagement? And I find the debate fascinating because, they're not mutually exclusive. What makes the situation in Iran so poor is that they're dealing with both. They're dealing with mismanagement, which, like I said, is something that we've seen, I think, unfortunately, in most cases in the way states have dealt with the pandemic, but also it's compounded greatly by sanctions. And when you talk to people there, when I talk to my family, that is one of the fears that they name. They name both very easily. They say, they should have taken it more seriously, this and that. But there's also, one of the things that's interesting is they talk about these sort of cultural things where they say a lot of people don't listen, even though there's been, government announcements, programs on television. Doctors themselves, medical staff from weeks earlier have really started their own social media campaign on apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, Instagram, trying to get people to stay inside. And, there's some argument that says, it's a cultural thing, people just don't listen. But it's a little unfair to put it that way, because in reality, a lot of the people who are going out because they are poor and because they cannot afford to just stay home. And the government is in no position to really economically afford the ability to lock down the entire country. And we're seeing a similar debate, happen in real time in the United States. There's the economic debate, and then there's the health debate, which, of course, now, in my opinion, people's health should come first. But it's sort of misleading for people in a position to be able to stay home to have that expectation of people who are living paycheck to paycheck or don't have the means otherwise. And so there is that component to consider as well. And from the Iranian point of view, much of that economic devastation has come because of sanctions. There's really no way of understanding the situation without understanding both sides, which is mismanagement and missteps on the part of the government, but of course, the larger economic devastation of U.S. sanctions.
Right, exactly. There's been some discussion about the fact that there was a parliamentary election, I believe in February, just as the epidemic was becoming known. And also, of course, we've just finished the season of Persian New Year. So that also is typically an occasion when people go out and visit one another. That would certainly make it more difficult to keep people indoors.
It is, and I know a lot of the people I know, to be fair, I'm talking about, middle class people, and my family and friends have done a very good job, I think, of adhering to the quarantine guidelines. In fact, I have a lot of family who are in the medical field themselves, and so that's why I'm privy to this fact that I'm seeing my own cousins who are just posting repeatedly, please stay home, take these precautions. These are the things that we can do as people beyond what the medicine and the economics or any of that. Practicing social distancing, staying at home. So that campaign was there. And in terms of the holidays, one of the things that happened during the holidays is typically in Iran, you have 13 days off at the beginning of the new year. And that a lot of people, especially in Tehran, which is the most populated city, will go to the north towards like the Caspian Sea, rent villas and stay there for their vacations. And a lot of people still try to do that, and this was something where, again, people tried to step in and say, listen, we have to take certain measures and take this more seriously. But of course, again, like we're seeing in the case of the United States, we keep getting told to stay home, but there's no official sort of lockdown that keeps us in place. And so that's why a lot of people still do go out. It's much more social pressure to stay in than it is any kind of military or authoritative structure that's making people stay home. Mm-hmm. And that's happening in both cases. And something else, I wanted to note, of course, you brought up the numbers. The total cases in Iran are now over 40,000. You have 2,700 reported deaths. Again, this isn't unique to Iran. Those numbers are very likely much higher on all counts, right? The number of cases and the number of deaths, very likely, because they're following guidelines that they're also being told, right? They're saying don't examine, people who have already died, because when you have limited resources, we're trying to sort of deal with the problem at hand. And so the numbers that we're seeing from every country is likely not a full picture of what's going on. And of course, there's two aspects to it. One is simply, especially the number of cases, so many people are asymptomatic or won't go to a doctor necessarily because their symptoms aren't that bad, that we don't really know how many cases there are anywhere. And of course, none of these governments want to show that they're failing at curbing this outbreak. So, again, like I want to be fair to the fact that the numbers that we're looking at are likely much lower than what is the reality on the ground.
Oh, I'm sure they are. Well, you mentioned the sanctions, and I saw recently where Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has called the sanctions medical terror against the Iranian people that exceeds what would be permissible on the battlefield. He's calling the international community to stop supporting the war crimes of the Trump administration and ignore the sanctions. But the Trump administration appears to be actually increasing the sanctions at this point. And I know your organization, NIAC, is working on this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do and what kind of progress you hope to make?
Absolutely. We've been against this particular sanctions policy that the Trump administration has imposed because of the starting point of how we got here, right? So the reason why this administration imposed sanctions on Iran was because we quit the Iran nuclear deal, a deal that was agreed upon by the United States under the Obama presidency. And really, Iran was abiding by the deal, was in full compliance with the deal. Even a year after the U.S. quit the deal, they still remained in full compliance with the deal. So the reason we've, before this pandemic even, been against sanctions is because really punishing a state for abiding by an agreement that we are party to, flies in the face of all sort of protocols of international decorum, international accords, why we have an international community that comes to these agreements. And because it creates more instability in the region, the argument has been, and I think we've seen all of this, it's created more instability in the region. Iran is now closer, they're not on their way to a nuclear weapon by any means, but they are closer to that path than they were when they were abiding by the deal. And we haven't gotten anything positive out of the actions of the United States in this regard. If anything, in terms of U.S. interest itself, it's gone against every interest that we have, right? The Trump administration, President Trump himself has stated outright that his goal is for Iran not to get a nuclear weapon. And every step he's taken thus far has gotten us further from that goal than it's gotten us closer to it. Something interesting, right. The Terrence Group came out with a survey last week of Trump voters in key swing states. And the majority, and these are Republican Trump supporting voters, and the majority were thought that Iran being prevented from getting a nuclear weapon is a critical issue, but the majority also believed that negotiations was the best way of getting there, rather than open conflict or military conflict. So this is not just the opinion of our organization. This is the majority of opinion of the current president's voting base and of the country itself. So this is, in any country where we talk about democracy and the will of the people being fulfilled, Americans do not want a war. They don't want a conflict. They want peaceful negotiations, and they want Iran not to get a nuclear weapon. All of those were part of the deal, and we've sort of been put on this path since abrogating the deal. Now, under this current situation, one could argue that the sanctions were, inhumane because of the how much the economy has been devastated. But under this current situation, it's really taken on a completely different form, which is why you see international calls from the UN, from other states, even from our own allies like the UK, saying that this is a time to ease sanctions on Iran. And not just Iran, this is a time to ease sanctions on anyone who's being sanctioned, because there is now a challenge that we face that is global in nature, and we are only as strong as our weakest states. That's what we've seen. The attempt at closing our borders and thinking that that was going to prevent this disease from spreading has obviously been shown false. This is a pandemic. And as long as there are hotspots that aren't being helped, then we're all at risk. We all continue to be at risk. Not to mention the sort of moral view that you can take of it, which is what kind of policy do we accept putting in place where we now are openly fine with innocent civilians, the casualties of innocent civilians. So there's no argument to be made under these conditions that say, sanctions are really hurting the Iranian government, not the Iranian people. That's clearly not the case in a global pandemic. These are people who are dying. So all sort of politicking and excuses that would allow someone to still make the argument, which again I would have disagreed with even before, but would allow someone to make the argument that this is targeting an authoritarian government in Iran, that is completely out the window. That's not the situation at hand right now. This is not hurting the government. This is hurting the people. In fact, you could make the argument that right now, because of social distancing, because people are afraid to even leave their houses for fear of getting sick, there is no way for Iranian people, even if they wanted to mobilize against a state if they didn't agree with it, there's no way for them to do so because they are being hit by a virus that is so contagious and that is so deadly. So really, none of the logic really still fits in this situation. It is the humane thing to do to lift sanctions in this situation.
One of the things that I found just really disingenuous was Trump offering to help Iran with this crisis, and Pompeo asserting that humanitarian aid was not sanctioned, and the U.S. would help Iran if Iran asked for it, which is an offer, of course, Ayatollah Khamenei rejected out of hand. His quote, I think, was very good. Considering the circumstances that exist, what reasonable individual can trust you? Speaking to Trump, there's such a distrust between these two governments, and I'm wondering how we can get past that.
As an American, I'm an Iranian American, so I have, sort of to be fair, a stake on both sides. My extended family lives in Iran. I have many friends there, and so I care a great deal about what happens in the country. But as an American, really, I want to believe that our word is our bond, that when we say something, not this is just in the case of Iran, this is the way that we behave as a state within the international community, that that we are a leader in the world. And part of leadership is being accountable. And we can talk about offers and someone like Secretary of State Pompeo, and Secretary of State Pompeo has said many times, I stand with the Iranian people. He talks about human rights, he talks about the authoritarian nature of the state. And yet he is one of the people who pushed for President Trump to abrogate the JCPOA. He's talked against it from the very beginning, even though it was supported by the vast majority of Iranians, especially at the time that it was implemented. Right now, years later, with not only not gaining anything, but actually being punished because of the deal in certain ways. Now it's fallen out of favor. But at the time, it was the will of the Iranian people. He has supported the imposition of sanctions. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, in the middle of this kind of an epidemic, like you mentioned, we increased sanctions. And, the statement from the State Department, from Secretary of State Pompeo's actual, official page was, we are not letting up on sanctions at all. And so it really speaks to how genuine that kind of a message is. And the reason why it's not being received genuinely, because people talk about the humanitarian exemptions. The reality on the ground is not that. And it's as simple as, de jure versus de facto. Sure, in writing, that's the case. In writing, humanitarian aid is exempt. But in reality, no bank, no company, no one that's part of, basically the world economy is willing to take a risk of violating US sanctions and being punished by the largest economy in the world for, sending some medicines to Iran. It's just not, in terms of an economic standpoint for them, it makes no sense to do so. And so no one's willing to do these transactions. If there are no bank transactions, then they're not getting those materials. And there are countless articles written about this. There's articles written, there's all sorts of testimony from people inside of Iran that speaks to the fact that these medicines, these specialized medicines, are no longer available. And this was happening before the pandemic, right? And one of the things I always want to add is it's not just a matter of humanitarian aid, though, is it? And we can see that in our own situation. If you look at the United States, we are clearly not under sanctions anywhere. We theoretically have the most access to the most resources of any country in the world. And if you go to a store, they're empty. Stores are empty. We are in a state of panic about the potential of an impending economic sort of collapse or an economic recession, and how this is going to, be a detriment in our ability to fight against this pandemic. And yet we've already done that in the case of Iran, right? So it's not just a matter of, whether or not they have access to medicines, but everything that goes into a much more complicated task, which is fighting this pandemic. And so we just had a $2 trillion stimulus package passed because of the economic side, the economic problems that this is going to entail. Iran has no ability to do that. So you're fighting it on multiple fronts, and without the lifting of the sanctions, there's simply no way for them to fight it. Even if you tried to send medicines, which is still impeded with the sanctions that are in place, it would not be enough to be able to combat something that is so devastating across the sort of social economic spectrum of any state that's dealing with it.
At least China, as I understand, is sending some help to Iran in spite of the sanctions.
Oh, and I think, China has been, anytime you say something about another state, the idea is that you're that I'm somehow endorsing that state. No,
right? No,
China's authoritarianism is still in place, but nonetheless, they are not only helping Iran; they're helping really everywhere. There's Chinese medics that were just in the UK, in Iraq. So they are really trying to fight this on many fronts. And looking at China in terms of this conversation when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, it's clearly been something that's politicized in the case of Iran and the US, but it's also something that's politicized in the case of the US and China. And I think the argument that is really important to understand right now, and I think this is what a lot of people, at least from circles that I am privy to, I hear repeatedly, is that this is not the time for politicking, really. You have the UN, you have international bodies not only calling for lifting of sanctions on all countries during this pandemic, but also calling for like a global ceasefire, because it is quite simply, this is something that affects every state. It knows no borders, no gender, no religion, no race. Its victims are everyone. And without a more unified response, we're going to continue to have these blunders that now, the United States, it's, if you think about the US case, it's really disheartening to think that we had so much time to prepare, because in terms of the timeline, we were so far behind everyone else. And yet now we are, the country in the world that has by far the most cases.
And we certainly can't complain too much about mismanagement of this situation by any other nation, given our own. Let's switch a little bit back to America, though. You grew up, I think, in what I think is the largest Iranian American community in the U.S. and the L.A. area. And, there's just been an increased amount of hostility by the U.S. government toward Iran ever since the 1979 revolution. We've had sanctions, a travel ban, recently the assassination of General Soleimani. What are the effects of all these things on Iranian Americans here in the U.S.?
I am very appreciative for the life that I've had in the United States. I was born here. I was raised here. My parents are immigrants from Iran, and which is, I think, typical of many immigrant stories. They, came to a new country. They worked very hard, and they tried to give their children the best opportunities that they could. And I'm eternally grateful for all of that. But it's also challenging when, you sort of grow up feeling like an outsider in your own country. And I'll give you, an anecdotal sort of example from my own life. It's, because of my job and my position, there's all of what I'm saying here, I say publicly, because these are, my opinions in terms of how my government, which is the United States, should act vis-a-vis Iran and its general international relations. And I get attacked all the time and being told I should either be, sent back to Iran or deported. And I find it fascinating, these sort of types of attacks, because every time someone says I should be deported, I always wonder where to. Like, this is where I was born. So I'm not really sure where I'm being deported to. But so that happens more when we're in this political conflict, And another sort of anecdotal example would be soon after, just days after the assassination of General Soleimani, Iranian Americans were being detained at different ports of entry in the United States. And being questioned. And these aren't people with visas that are coming in. These are Iranian Americans. These were citizens and green card holders being questioned for their political points of view in order to enter their own country. And that's plainly discriminatory. That's not how, you don't ask somebody their political opinion and to allow them back into their own country. Other countries do that, but we claim to be quite different than them. So, those are the things. Those are the events that sort of take place where your position as an American in the country, you feel like it gets questioned. And it is a frustrating feeling. And I've felt like over the last several months, especially, there's been a lot of anxiety within the community of being just sort of vilified for different things that are going on. And, the coronavirus is a horrible thing that's happening in the world. But in many ways, it presents us with an opportunity to, a lot of people say this is going to change things. Nothing's going to be the same after the coronavirus. And the sort of same mentality that I remember when I was younger, when 9/11 happened, right? It was like, this is a moment that will change things. Nothing will be the same after this watershed. And what I hope that we're going to take from it is a better understanding of how the world is connected. I saw posts of doctors in the UK that had died fighting the coronavirus, and they were all immigrants to the UK. And the idea, again, that immigrants are treated badly, or there's these xenophobic ways of thinking about things, like, well, these are the people who are now fighting to protect you. So maybe it's a moment, and I'm always hopefully optimistic, that maybe these are moments that we can really reflect and approach problems in a more internationalist way. Because there are other challenges that we will face, such as climate change, which will require the same kind of response. So being, Iranian American is very interesting, because I feel like we're at sort of this at a crossroads in all of the major issues that are occurring in our country right now. Whether it's things like, xenophobia and immigration, which is seen in the travel ban or the Muslim ban, Iranian Americans are affected by that. Whether it's our foreign policy and the worry of war, obviously that state that we're most concerned about right now is Iran. Again, we find ourselves in the center of that. So there are all sorts of issues that our community faces, but I hope that this can be a turning point for our community to really feel like, especially for a second generation, that we are equally a part of that American fabric.
Well, I think the whole American community needs to have some change and growth from this event. Not just the Iranian Americans, but the rest of us as well.
And on many levels.
Well, thanks very much for sharing your insights and experience with us, Assal. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
A glance at news headlines after this interview did not raise hopes for a relaxation of sanctions on Iran. Quite the opposite. The New York Times ran a story last week saying, quote, The Pentagon has ordered military commanders to plan for an escalation of American combat in Iraq, issuing a directive last week to prepare a campaign to destroy an Iranian-backed militia group that has threatened more attacks against American troops. But the U.S. top commander in Iraq has warned that such a campaign could be bloody and counterproductive and risks war with Iran, end quote. Writing in The Progressive, Steve Ehrlich said, quote, Iran currently faces a series of crises, low international oil prices, major flooding in the south, and a spreading coronavirus pandemic, and harsh unilateral U.S. sanctions have severely damaged the Iranian economy, but have not changed Iran's policies in the region, nor has U.S. military action. Nevertheless, the Trump administration is pressuring the new Iraqi prime minister to cut off imports of Iranian gas and electricity in keeping with U.S. sanctions. On March 16th, U.S. Marines and forces of the United Arab Emirates held a major military exercise called Native Fury. They stormed an imaginary city with helicopters circling overhead. In the face of a worldwide pandemic, the U.S. is actively threatening Iran with military attack. The actions of the Trump administration are dangerous, foolish, and cruel, and of course illegal under international law. The current frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, Joe Biden, refused to commit to even a temporary lifting of U.S. sanctions on Iran, saying he doesn't have enough information on the situation in Iran to decide whether the U.S. should continue borrowing essential medical supplies from the Iranian people. Writing in the Middle East Eye, former Italian diplomat Marco Carnello said what many of us are thinking, quote, the essential problem of Biden and the Democratic Party establishment's foreign policy vision is that it sticks to the outdated notion of the indispensable nation, according to which we will once more have America lead the world as a force for progress. This position is combined with the equally mistaken belief that the U.S., the most powerful nation in history, must prioritize keeping itself safe. It's increasingly depressing that in the 21st century, the leading Republican and Democratic candidates remain attached to the anachronistic and unsubstantiated belief that the U.S. faces all sorts of external threats — Russia, China, Iran, terrorism, authoritarianism, unfair trade practices, and so forth — when the evidence shows the real threats are within its own borders, end quote. Thanks again to Assal Rad of the National Iranian American Council for joining me this week on Wider View. And you can check the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com to links to NIAC and their campaign to remove sanctions. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.